Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of What's on My Desk, and today it's all about Seiko, 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 and more Seiko. A lot of buzz around Seiko nowadays, specifically the Grand Seiko. They say like hotcakes, you'd be hard pressed to get that watch at more of a 10 to 20% discount if you are lucky. I didn't really bring Grand Seikos with me. In fact, I brought completely something else, which I'm going to get into later, but I wanted to talk about Seiko. And the best place to start would probably be 1969 when Seiko came out with the world's first quartz watch, right? It was a revolution. They called it the quartz revolution. It was the fancy watch killer, and by fancy watch, I mean your standard mechanical high-end watches. It's flipped the Swiss watch industry upside down. And indeed, at the time, it was a killer. It got to a point where the big boys were following suit. In the likes of Rolex, Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, everybody and their mother started making quartz watches just to sort of keep up with that stuff. Of course, they weren't cheap enough. And indeed, it seemed like Seiko or the quartz wars were seemingly going to be the killer of the watch industry as we know it today. Of course, there was a savior in that time, a gentleman by the name of Nicolas Hayek, who came out with the Swatch watch. You guys remember that one. I'm not going to get into the history of how that all unfolded. We don't have that kind of time on this episode, but this guy basically came out with the Swatch watch, which was Swiss answer to the Japanese quartz watches, which generated a ton of sale, a crap ton of money. And instead of taking those profits, he took those profits and he put them back into the traditional watchmaking of brands like Blancpain, like La Chute, and so on and so forth, creating the Swatch Group as we know it today, and therefore saving the watch industry. There's a great video I'm going to link in below by a gentleman by the name of CQ, who is with WatchBox. He actually did an entire episode dedicated to Nicolas and how he indeed saved the watch industry. But that's not what this episode is about. Let's talk about Seiko. Let's talk about Seiko's history. A brand that's been around since 1881. That's right. This is a brand that's 230 years old now, almost, right? 1881, a gentleman by the name of Kintaro Hattori opens up a small shop selling and repairing clocks in Ginza, Tokyo. He starts producing wall clocks, and a company by the name of Seiko is formed, which is now known as Seiko, but we'll get to that in a minute. Just a couple of years later, they came out with the first pocket watch, and in 1913 is where they make the first Japanese wristwatch called the Laurel. It wasn't until about a decade later until they produced a wristwatch that was actually named Seiko. That was in 1924. In 1929, they became the official pocket watch of the railway system in Japan. In 1932, they constructed the Waco clock tower, the familiar face of Ginza. In the 50s, they came out with the Diashock system, which actually prevented parts of your watch from being damaged as you drop the watch. In 1959, they came out with the Jar Marble, which was the self-winding watch, and it had the simple claw lever system, which allowed the oscillating weight to obviously wind the watch either way. And then came year 1960. What were some of the big events that happened in 1960? Ian, please. Besides everything Ian just threw up on the screen, it was also the birth year of the Grand Seiko. This was Seiko's way to show that we can make high-end, high-quality mechanical watches, much like the big boys in Switzerland, and we're gonna call this one the Grand Seiko. They picked the most skillful watchmakers that Seiko had at the time. They went high in the mountains to Nagano, grabbed the best watchmakers they had at the time, and they gave them the task of make me the most kick-ass, the most accurate, show the world what Seiko can do when it comes to mechanical watches, and exactly that they did, and the Grand Seiko was born in 1960. The 60s was a big year for them. First Japanese stopwatch, first Japanese diver's watch. In 1969, Caliber 6139 was born, which was the world's first automatic chronograph, equipped both with vertical clutch and column wheel, which is also a pretty big deal. And that's the year that I started with, 1969, and the world's first quartz watch was born. And it was called Seiko Quartz Astron, which is exactly what I brought on my desk today. These are today's version of Astrons, and again, I'm going to get into them in just a little bit. Before that, just a little more about Seiko and Seiko's history. 1963, introduction of the first 6-digital watch. Remember those things? Yeah, they're still pretty cool till this day, to where I know a lot of guys that actually wear these old LCD watches from Casio and Seiko and so on and so forth. They're just really cool watches, right? But imagine 1973, how cool were they back then? I wasn't even born then, right? And of course, that wasn't enough. Then they took the digital watch, took it to the next level. In 1975, which is when I was born, they made one that had a stopwatch functionality with it as well. So they started taking that LCD, that digital display functionality, to the next level and giving you more options with it. My favorite was probably going to be 1982. When they made the TV watch. You guys remember that one? You sort of got this Walkman looking thing, right, with a pair of headphones, and you had your digital display on your watch, maybe about this big, and you can tune into the stations, and you can actually watch TV on your watch. Tell me that's not futuristic. Again, we're talking about 1982, not 2019, right? Let's talk about James Bond stuff, right? 1983, they came out with the same watch and gave it a voice recording functionality, so you can actually record on your wristwatch. And in that same year, they decided to show the world that, look, we're not just gonna stick to quartz, we're gonna stick to our roots. We did create some great mechanical timepieces, much like the Grand Seiko, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna combine the two. And they made an analog and quartz chronograph. And then my favorite in what I call the age of Back to the Future for Seiko, which was the 80s, they made the first computer watch. It was a digital watch that connected to a calculator looking thing, right? The watch had the ability to store contacts. The watch had the ability to store a diary. I think you could store up to 2,000 characters of whatever in there if you wanted to. Let's talk about use of ceramic. It was in 1986 that it was Seiko that made the world's first ceramic case diver watches, in which you could dive up to 1,000 meters. 1988 was a big year as well. It was the year when my family migrated to the United States of America, but that's not what this episode is about. 1988, they made the first kinetic quartz watch. So, same concept. Oscillating rotor, right? But now this oscillating rotor is actually producing electricity, therefore powering your quartz watch and it not needing a battery. Definitely a big deal. Now to talk about Grand Seikos, which is undoubtedly one of the hottest topics today and one of the hottest mechanical watches. The introduction of the Grand Seiko came in 1998 and it's now being produced till today. And then of course right after that, in 1999, they introduced the famous Seiko Spring Drive, which is a spring-driven luxury watch with the accuracy of a quartz watch. They replaced the traditional escapement with a completely new regulator, right? Which is actually also silent. You can't even hear it. 2005, the 3-wave solar radio watch, US, Germany, and Japan waves, and the kinetic perpetual. As the energy is produced by motion, the energy is actually stored and then released back into the watch as needed, and a watch that's set to be accurate till year 2100. I don't think I'll be around in the year 2100 to check that out, but if any of you guys are watching this 80 years from now, let me know if you have one of those watches, if they kept time till 2100. 2009, the first high-beat Grand Seiko. Again, a watch that's very coveted and people want. They continued with the Grand Seikos. They kept improving them. They kept on doing new things with them. They did a few high-end things. In 2006, they did the Sonnery, and then in 2011, they did the Credder minute repeater. So they did go high-end, I should say high complication. And finally, it brings me to what's on my desk, and that's the year 2012, when they came out with the Seiko Astron GPS watches, and this is what I have on my desk today. I brought a few samples to show you guys. Again, I'm not going to get into super details of this watch. I'm just going to show you these watches. But in a nutshell, what these watches are is they automatically adjust themselves regardless of what time zone you are in. These are all world time watches, and they do so by receiving GPS signals from GPS satellites, ensuring that your watch is absolutely accurate regardless of where you are in the world, where you may be traveling, and it does so automatically. They did it by actually sticking a low energy consuming GPS receiver into this watch. That's right, there's a GPS receiver in every single one of these watches. This is probably my favorite one. Kind of looks like an HYT, the way the crystal is designed. Lots of different displays, and it actually shows you the number of satellites it's talking to as it's receiving that signal. Probably take forever to go through the functionality of these timepieces. Before you use this watch, you actually have to read a manual. It's not as straightforward as it looks. It's solar. It says GPS solar watch, and the reason for that is because this will only watch and only receive a satellite signal if the sun is hitting the watch. If the watch is under asleep somewhere, it will not receive that signal. But nevertheless, the minute you bring it into light, boom, magic happens. Its hands start to move, and the watch adjusts itself to the exact precise time in the time zone that you are in. So 1969 to 2012, 31, that's 43 years later, from the very first Astron that they made to what you see today. They obviously have come a long way. Technology has come a long way since then. but the history nevertheless is there, going back to the late 1800s. In the case of these quartz pieces, we're going back to 1969 to a watch that revolutionized the watch industry as we know it today. So what happened in the last few years? 2014, the Grand Seiko GMT won the Grand Prix Horology from Geneva Prize. That was in 2014. I guess it's important to mention that in 2016, they made their first tourbillon watch. And finally, in 2017, Grand Seiko became its own brand. Seiko's weird in the way where actually the Astron is considered to be a brand within the Seiko family, whereas most companies break their stuff down by collections, like AP Royal Oak or Jules or Code 1159, right? They actually brand their stuff out separately. So Astron is actually its own brand. And as of 2017, the Grand Seiko is also its own brand. I don't know if it's done for marketing purposes, financial purposes, or whatever it is. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. So, guys, I know this is sort of an unusual what's on my desk. I did give you a glimpse of the history of Seiko, which I think is extremely important. Seiko as a company takes a huge spot in the history of horology. And I know that a lot of guys, won't consider quartz watches as part of that horological world. And, most of them are just cheap watches that are made that you can pick up for $10, $20. And seemingly the technology is the same in all of them. Well, when it comes to Seiko, that's not the case. Seiko is a huge part of horological history. The fact that they were the first ones that came out with the quartz technology, the fact that they've been around almost 230 years makes them a very, very big boy in the industry. These are guys that potentially could have put the entire high-end Swiss watch manufacturing out of business in the 70s. They almost did. It's pretty crazy. And I hope you guys don't look at them as the enemy, so to speak, of the mechanical watch. The mechanical watches are here to stay. They're a completely separate entity. And I think they made a pretty big stand with their Grand Seiko watches. I know a lot of you guys out there asking me to talk about the Grand Seiko. I don't have one. As soon as I do, I will show you one. These are the Seikos I happen to have here. They're here to stay. They're going to be here for another 200 years from now, and they're going to continue innovating. This innovation alone, having a GPS receiver inside your watch, is pretty kick-ass, if you ask me. And I know that their research and development department is out there trying to come up with something different. They're not the type of company that's going to get out there and try to compete with the iPhone, right? Or the Apple Watch, respectively, or any of the Droid model watches that are out there that numerous companies have already made, like Tag Heuer or Hublot, right? Just like when they came out with the quartz watch in 1969 and later came out with a TV watch and the entire world was wowed, I'm expecting to see something from them once again that will wow the world over and over again. And this is the type of company Seiko is, and this is what they're going to continue doing. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As usual, hit the like button if you like this video. Share this with all your friends who think may enjoy this type of content. And I'll see you guys next week for more What You Use and other videos.